Why do we need diversity in conducting? What is conducting? What does a conductor even do? What roles does that person waving their arms in front of the musicians play in music? We hear in music in films and video games, at live concerts, and so many other places throughout our day. We don't even think about all the preparation and work that goes into making music, right? But most importantly, why should we even care? Now, I'd wager that if you were a musician, or even perhaps a theater kid, you've seen or even heard of a conductor, right? You might even know who this man is. Or you might be a little bit more hip to the time, and you might even know who this person is. But I would bet few of you knew who these people are. And probably none of you know who these guys are. And before we even start talking about diversity, first we must answer the question, what is conducting? Now, while you might think a conductor just gets up there and waves his hands for a living, it's a bit more complicated than that. Now, waving your hands as a musical gesture has been around since antiquity. But what we know of and understand as conducting in the modern era really originated all back with the Guidonian hand, right? Now, the Guidonian hand had this idea that pointing to different parts of your hand could indicate different pitches. And later throughout time, this developed into more complex things, like keeping time for an ensemble to make sure everybody stays together. Now, by the time we get to the Baroque era, we have someone known as Jean-Baptiste Lully, who is known as the father of conducting for having used the staff to beat the ground so everybody could feel the pulse. He is infamously known for having stabbed himself in the foot and dying of gangrene. Fast forward a little bit, things really become interesting when in Germany they had the idea that someone should lead and be in charge of church music full time, right? And thus we have the Kapellmeister enter the scene. Now, the most widely recognized Kapellmeister in history is no other than J.S. Bach himself. Now, this tradition of Kapellmeister that stemmed out of the church will later lead us to the modern-day choral conductor. But on the flip side, in the secular world, we see a two-conductor system originally out of opera houses. This idea was that concertmasters would show all the expressive aspects of the music with their violin playing, while the keyboardist handled all the technical aspects, such as when to stop and start the music, when to slow down, when to speed up, etc., etc. Now, fast forward just a few decades from when Bach appeared on the scene, and we have none other than Joseph Haydn himself. Now, Haydn was the first conductor ever to use a baton in record of any type. We don't know exactly what this baton looked like, but we know he used something in his hand while he conducted. And he conducted his creations with a baton. And it was such a major event. Now, up until this point, conducting has yet to be standardized in any way. Batons would appear and not appear in different ensembles, and they would be in different shapes and sizes. And as the orchestra was changing and instruments were becoming more standardized, it was becoming very apparent in the musical world that something needed to be done, something needed to change. Now that we know what conducting is, we now must answer the question, what does a conductor even do? Well, What a conductor has done has changed over time, as we've just discussed. But the discipline was not standardized until these two men were doing some of their own writings and philosophies on what it meant to be a conductor and how that should look like. Now, Mendelssohn and Wagner talked a lot about conducting and had a lot ideas and philosophies on what it meant to be a conductor, right? They talked about how you should hold the baton in your right hand and how you should be expressive in your left hand and how you should negotiate the two. Now, this brings us to the biggest discussion in conducting to date, which is artistry versus technique. When is it acceptable to show the music and be all expressive, and when do you have to be clear and precise so the orchestra or whatever the ensemble is knows exactly what to do and when to do it? Now, there have been various different viewpoints on this that fall on either side of the coin, and the literature on this and on conducting in general is forever expanding, right? Now, regardless of what group that you fall under, which camp of ideology you want to prescribe to, all of what conductors do can be summarized into 3 steps. Step 1, preparation, the scholar. The prep time is the time before the conductor gets in front of the group. During this step, the conductor learns all of the cues, all of the cutoffs, all the articulations, all the dynamics, instrumentation, all the language of the composer, the French, German, Italian. They do this so that there is no ambiguity between what the composer asks of the musicians, first of all, and so that they have the time to create a clear musical idea of how they want to shape the music in their head. This is where that musical vision is formed and created, and that is what is unique to every conductor. Step 2, diagnosis, the teacher. Now, having mastered the music and can recite it forwards and backwards, ups and down, now comes the time where the conductor has to get the ensemble to reach that musical vision that they've set up in their mind. This is the stage where you start talking about rhythms, intonation, balance, tempo, and just in general how you as the conductor communicate amongst the musicians and how they communicate amongst each other over the course of the piece. Step 3, procedure, the musician. In this step, having done your studying, having diagnosed the issues, you must find a way to play the ensemble with your hands. Now you must articulate what you want and where you want it. Telling the ensemble isn't enough, right? You have to remember that it isn't just what's on the paper that makes a really good performance. It's how they bring the music that's on the paper to life. So, this is that balancing act of artistry and technique that conductors deal with for their whole careers. It all is a culmination in this step. Now, I'm sure you've gotten to this far and must be wondering, so why does diversity even matter in classical music, right? It's all music of old dead white guys anyways. Well, yes, to a degree, you are correct in your thinking. But the problem is, it's so much more than that. You don't need me to tell you that music is constantly changing. You hear it for yourself every day. So, take for example this sacred music piece. It's the same piece of music with 2 different versions that are both unique to the country of origin. And both of these versions can be found in a church setting. Now, in the past 100 years or so, we have seen so much more inclusion of other musical traditions within classical music to the point where it's become fully integrated with classical music. I mean, just look at how Kodai incorporated folk music traditions into his compositions, or how Duke Ellington incorporated jazz into his orchestral works, or even Gershwin his American in Paris. Mahler's First Symphony, especially the third movement, straight up sounds like a klezmer band, right? This integration of musical traditions into classical music has been around for the past 100 years, if not longer. And it's especially not going anywhere. It's only getting bigger with each passing day. Now, take for example this gospel music piece, which is very much a part of sacred music.
We worship you just because you're God, because you're Jehovah Jireh. You are my provider. You're Jehovah Nissi. You're the man that watches over me. We worship you because you're Jehovah Sitkanu. You're my righteousness. We worship you because you're Jehovah Rapha. When I get sick in my body, you still deserve.
It's even happening with electronic music. Now, after all this, we can now talk about diversity and what it looks like. Not only has conducting been a male-dominated profession, it's been almost exclusively a white male profession. That standard, whether conscious or subconsciously taught to us, is what should change. It has to change. It needs to change. Throughout human history, we found ways to marginalize and oppress people and separate people into different tribes and treat people differently, whether it be based on gender, sexuality, handedness, ethnicity, or anything else and everything else in between, right? Music has been no exception. Don't just take my word for it. Listen to some professionals in the field talking about some of their experiences and what they've witnessed in their lives.
Gosh, when I first started out, I was told that because of my body frame, shape, size, that I would never be able to conduct loud or aggressive or passionate music as adequately as a male, because my body was not suited to that style of music. And so that I should focus on the things that my body showed. So I worked extra hard to make sure that I can conduct fortissimo and accents and, all the rest. So, I mean, that was early on. That was as a student. When I was in grad school, my colleagues, and they did not intend for this to be negative, but we all know that intent is not the same as impact. But one of my colleagues implied to me that the only reason I was accepted was because I was a woman, and said, I'll never forget these words, "We needed to have a woman, so we knew at least one would be accepted." I'm so happy that's you.
It was. I also have friends that would play in the trombone section in Symphoria, and one of them would tell me about another person in the brass section who, whenever I was on the podium, would just be muttering under his breath, like constantly, and just excoriating me.
Even without saying it, the way we've structured our education absolutely implies not just an otherism, but a left-hand. And I, by not including music, certain kinds of music in our curriculum, I never learned much about the Latin American Baroque. I'm teaching my choral literature class and we weren't covering it. And what does that say to that student? That we're covering everything else in the Baroque, but we're not looking at Peru and Mexico? That's a problem. So we fixed that. But I wasn't taught anything about that music. So everything that I'm teaching now has to be self-taught, essentially.
They're thinking about programming in terms of diversity or awareness of these issues in the field of conducting. I'd say at that point there was more sort of general curiosity around women in non-traditional fields in music. And I had that on two levels. First, as a trombone player. So there was the women orchestral brass player that was non-traditional. And then going into conducting, that was stepping from one field where women are in the minority to another one. And at the time, we had Maren Alsop was already in Baltimore. Joanne Falletta, I think, was already in Buffalo at that point. So we had those two women in particular as role models, but there was not really a network or support system for any of this. I mean, it was really,
Right.
You were kind of on your own, unless you really, really were aggressive about getting mentored. And I wish that I had been more aggressive in that way.
Now take a moment and think back to your childhood. Imagine a world where all you wanted to do in life was music. All you ever wanted to do was music. All you wanted to do was bring your voice, your creativity, your ideas, your imagination into music. But not only have you never seen anyone that looks like you, dresses like you, talks like you, acts like you, in music, especially in front of a group of other people, but you yourself have never even been given the option to try. All because of the person you are. Is that the world you want to live in? Is that the world you want your children to grow up in? That is why we need diversity. That is why making sure everyone has the same opportunities is important. Shakespeare once wrote, "If music be the food of love, play on." So why not give everyone the same opportunity to express some love in the world, right?